Good afternoon, everybody. I am Vincent Pavan. I am a mathematician and assistant professor at University in Marseille, and today I will talk about falsified mathematics at the art of propaganda during COVID-19. So a bit of context. There is an importance of mathematics in making decisions, especially as mathematics have been at the heart of decision-making. I mean privation of liberties, and public communication, I mean propaganda. So, for example, two slogans which have been used in France by government, which is, first, we can debate everything except numbers, and second, there are numbers that sting much more than a needle. And in France, you have to know that important public decisions, they have been made after mathematical studies like lockdowns, closure of bars and restaurants, and sanitary and vaccinal pass. And my claiming here, because I have been studying these mathematical studies since 3 years now, is that without exception, all the decisions made after mathematical studies have been based on falsified studies. And when I tell falsified studies, this is not errors, this is not mistakes, this is fraud, this is falsification, and we are going to see that in details. So the first fraud is about the effect of the lockdowns on the spreading of the epidemic, and there has been, an article published in May 2020 by Kojmes and co-author, and this article announced that quarantine measures were effective in reducing transmission during lockdowns by 84%, okay? And this was a bit strange because, we have first result by John Ioannidis in January 2021, and these results state, and I quote Professor Ioannidis, "We find no clear, significant beneficial effect of NPIs on case growth in any countries, and in France, the effect was between -5 to 19% when compared with Sweden." So it is exactly the opposite results. And I did myself computations with very strong mathematical results, and I came to the conclusion that finally lockdowns multiplied by 1.5 the diffusion of the virus when compared with Sweden. So it seems that we have very contradiction between the results of science and the results of Ioannidis and myself. And I will explain to you finally how the author falsified the results. So the method of the author is what we call an inverse problem. So first they assume they have an equation to model the epidemic, and this equation, it has parameters. And normally, if you know the equation and the parameters, you are able to plot the curves. And in the curve, you have some kind of observable, curve, which are people who are hospitalized. But in practice, you don't know the parameters. You have the curves, you have the equations, and then you solve the inverse problem, which is finding the parameters. And you hope that in the parameters, there is a reduction of R0. So the author solved the inverse problem with a kind of very strange method, and they came to the conclusion that the inverse problem results in basic reproduction number decrease the very day of the lockdown instantaneously from 2.9 to 0.5. Okay? And to prove that this conclusion was consistent with observation, they plot the blue curves on the left, and they said, okay, if we solve now the theoretical equation, which the parameters of decreasing in R0, we got a perfect match between, finally, the theoretical affirmation and the observation. Okay? But, I was a bit skeptical because the equation modeling are very speculative, and the method they used was biased. So what's the miracle? And I decided to make the computation myself. And I took the program of the authors, I ran the program of the author, and I discovered that it was not the blue line they should have plotted, but the dark one on the right. And this dark curve does not match the observable data. And I was able to find in their own programs the line where they falsified the curve to impress the reader and the reviewers, and trying to prove that they had themselves proved that lockdowns reduced the increase of the epidemic. So this was the first fraud. And then there was also a second fraud in France concerning, the closing of bar and restaurant. And this is a very funny fraud, because you can debunk it with your children. That's very easy, you will know. But it was published in, statistical journal. And first, it's come with Prime Minister declaration in December 2020, and on the radio, Prime Minister declared, "It's heartbreaking for me to close bars and restaurants, but it's necessary. And Professor Fontane's study will confirm it." So what was the study by Professor Fontane? Let's see that. This was a very simple odds ratio study. What is odds ratio study? Very simple. You put a question for infected or non-infected people about yes or no frequentation. You collect the results and you compute what we call the odds ratio. And if this odds ratio is greater than 1, the frequentation is a risk for the infection, but if it is less than 1, the frequentation is not risky for the infection. Example, so Professor Fontane asked people, do you frequent religious gathering, both to infected and non-infected people? He gathers the answer, yes or no, and compute the odds ratio. And you get, because the confidence interval contains number 1, that religious gathering is not risky for, the infection. So Professor Fontane asked about 32 questions, yes or no question, to infected and non-infected, and he got the answer. So for instance, he asked questions about private social gathering, religious gathering, cultural gathering, and so on. And then came the question of bars and restaurants. And there is, something very strange, because the question on bar and restaurant was the only one where people were not able to answer, because they are missing answer to that question. This is very striking, because this is a very simple question, and you don't expect people not to be able to answer this question. So this is the first, and besides, while the questions on bars and restaurants are independent, it is exactly the same number of people who are not able to answer it. And which is strange is that the missing answer, they are just the result of infected people, because non-infected people are able to answer. And what is strange also is that Professor Fontane also asked questions about frequentation of bars and or restaurants, and any people is able to answer. So there is something which is very striking, is that because normally in such kind of, questions, you never ask questions like something or something else, because the signification of the connector or is not clear. There is in mathematics some kind of exclusive or, which is to be or not to be, and there is some kind of inclusive or. For instance, if you are an epidemiologist, you can be corrupted or incompetent, but likely both. Okay? So if you want to have answer to something or something else, first you ask the question about something alone, then you ask the question about something else alone, and finally you construct the question something or something else yourself. But if you do this way, it is not possible to have missing answer to the question of bar and not to have missing answer to the question of bar or restaurant. So there is something wrong, but what? Now a bit of mathematics. Let A be the set of people we go to bars, B the set of people we go to restaurants, then R union B is the set of people who go to bar or restaurants, and R intersection B is the set of people who go to bar and restaurants. And we have the famous cardinal formula here. And we have a problem because in this formula we are not able to get the cardinal of A, neither the cardinal of B, because of the... But this is not a real problem because we can reconstruct it, okay? So to do that, just take the missing answer, and you are convinced that this is artificial, and you dispatch them to yes or no response by keeping constant the ratio. I know you have a proper answer about bar frequentation, about restaurant frequentation, and using the cardinal formula, you are able to reconstruct yourself the question about the frequentation of bar and restaurant, okay? Very simple. And now you compute the other ratio, and this is a big surprise. Because frequenting bar and restaurant, this is safe. So the study proves that frequenting bar or restaurant is risky, but frequenting bar and restaurant is safe. So the conclusion is that after drinking, you need to go fast to a restaurant, and after eating, you need to go fast to a bar, and you will be safe. This is a scientific conclusion of what has been published. So now let us finish with the third fraud in France, and this concerns the transmission between vaccinated and non-vaccinated people. So we have the Health Minister declaration on TV, which is, with the vaccine, you reduce the risk of infecting others by 12. I mean, this is huge. And the affirmation is that vaccination is really efficient against transmission. But this is, a bit striking because we know that there is no test on transmission in clinical trials first. And Jenny Small, confirmed it in the European Parliament. And very soon during the campaign, we know that when they are infected, people have exactly the same load of virus, but depending on the vaccination. And the president of French Scientific Council admitted himself at TV that he announced in March 2021 to Health Minister that protection of vaccines against transmission is weak. So how is that possible to compute and to say that non-vaccinated people are 12 times more contagious than vaccinated people? And again, it is a fraud in the study. So what is the exact fraud? First, the study of the author, which has been published in the BMC in 2022. First, it is a purely numerical study. I mean, no measured data and no observation in that study. Second, the study, which is purely numerical, is based on speculative SCR equation. You have absolutely no validation of this equation with comparison to data. Besides, the set of parameters in the SCR model is arbitrary. And finally, and this is the most serious, the final indicators are improperly defined. And when you add all these, mistakes, you have something which is completely false. But Professor Delfrécy, president of French Scientific Council, wrote in his book that how to convince young people to get vaccinated. And our recommendations, meaning sanitary pass, were based on preliminary data indicating the effectiveness of vaccines against transmission. This means that this study in France was the only scientific reason why, they imposed sanitary pass. So let us see now more in detail the fraud. So first, the author made as if they were able to choose the parameters in the equation, which is not true, okay? Then they corrupted the final indicator on transmission. Let us see that. This is very easy to define the efficiency against transmission. You have the number of infectious non-vaccinated, the number of infectious vaccinated, and the number of people infected by infectious non-vaccinated, and the number of people infected by infectious vaccinated. And you compute sigma, which is 1 minus the ratio, and the relative risk between vaccinated and unvaccinated, which is 1 divided by 1 minus sigma. And of course, vaccine effectiveness is sigma greater than 0, tends to 1, and relative risk tends to infinity. But the problem is that the author did not use this ratio. Rather than dividing by, vaccinated infectious, they divided by vaccinated, and rather than multiplying by infectious non-vaccinated, they multiply by non-vaccinated. And the difference in the indicators is huge because instead of the right indicator, they have a falsified indicator which is multiplied by the efficiency of the vaccines. And if you assume, for instance, that your vaccine is 80% efficient against infection, your estimator about transmission is multiplied by 5. And this is exactly what they announce on the radio, on the TV, to say that, non-vaccinated people were 12 times more contagious than vaccinated people. So, as a conclusion, in France, you have 3 historical decisions on prevention of liberties, which are lockdowns, closing bars, restaurants, and imposing sanitary pass. And each of these decisions were justified by mathematical scientific studies supported by French Scientific Council. And all these studies were performed by the same, scientific, which is Simon Cauchemaz, and he's former student of Neil Ferguson. And all these studies were published in peer-reviewed journals, but all were frauds. They were able to be fraudulent, and also need a request for us to get retractation from the editors and to launch, criminal prosecution. So my opinion is that the community of mathematicians now need to gather against the misuse of mathematics in epidemiology and its falsification. Thank you very much.